You're about to hear the 3CR Community Radio podcast of Enpsychedelia. For more information on this show, head to 3cr.org.au and follow the links to the Enpsychedelia program page. Get in contact with us on Facebook, Twitter, or find us on our website. This is Enpsychedelia on 3CR Community Radio, 855 AM digital, and streaming at the website 3cr.org.au, which is also where you can go to find out more information about anything that you hear on this program. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and you can also email us to get in contact with us. Right now, we are speaking with Peter Sjöstedt-H. He is a philosopher from the UK who focuses on psychoactives and philosophy and the broad range of a very sort of not unearthed part of philosophy. Peter, welcome to Enpsychedelia.
Thank you. Hi.
So, Peter, tell us a little bit about what psychoactive philosophy is in the first place. Well, how do you approach philosophy through the lens of psychoactive substances?
Well, I suppose I have my interest is in the philosophy of mind, and it seems that a pinnacle of the mind or of consciousness is the psychedelic experience. So I think that in order to fully comprehend what the mind is, one must have experienced most of its facets, and one of those, of course, is induced by psychedelic intake.
Now, we've seen over the past couple of years a bit of a psychedelic renaissance in specifically sort of the health field around psychedelics and their potential as a therapeutic agent, as something that can help people when they are in a spot where they need help, and it's sort of defined as help under this current idea of health that we have. But we know a lot of people take psychedelics when they aren't necessarily sick or mentally ill or have something like post-traumatic stress disorder or something like that. But that's largely left out of this discussion at the moment. Is that?
I suppose that's because in order to make psychedelic drugs more acceptable to the mainstream, you first of all have to focus on the medical benefits thereof, which is completely understandable. But I think there's a slight danger that that's emphasized to the limitation of everything else. So, for example, the conference I attended in Amsterdam a couple of months ago focused mainly on therapy. But I thought to myself that it's a bit like you can make an analogy with the cinema. You know, like people who suffer from whatever form of mental distress. I think there's a focus on PTSD. If people go to the cinema, conceivably they would feel better after a while if they've never experienced the cinema before, if it's a completely new medium for them. And that's great, and of course that should be promoted. But of course, for me, I think that the interesting thing really is the film or the movie itself, the cinematography, the acting, and so on and so forth. You know, in other words, the psychedelic experience itself. And so therapy is one of its benefits, but I don't think it's the only. And in fact, I don't think it's the core benefit either.
In the past, when I've had friends who are a bit naive to psychedelics, and they've asked me, "Oh, did you have fun?" when they've known that I've had a time had a psychedelic experience, I sort of said to them that. Think of it like a movie. You're not always having fun in the middle of a movie. Sometimes it's quite frightening, or sometimes it's quite sad, and it really tugs on those emotions. But this whole story, that's the point of going to it. So I'm glad you made that that analogy there, because
that furthers it.
I suspect a lot of people feel that way.
Yeah, no, that furthers it. I mean, I generally don't like the idea of psychedelics being fun, you know, because it sort of demeans it, I think, slightly. I don't personally find it fun. I don't think that's the right word. I don't think getting high is a good enough expression at all either. I think it's more like an experience of the sublime. You know, philosophers like Edmund Burke, Kant, Schopenhauer used to speak of this difference between the beautiful and sublime. And the sublime was sometimes terrifying, you know, looking down from a cliff edge or something like this. Or the fear of God, the original fear of God from Rudolf Otto, for example, is a sort of example of the sublime. And I think psychedelic experiences are more like that in many ways. Thus, they're more sort of aesthetically and intellectually interesting. I don't think you can sort of categorize it along with fun activities like going on holiday or something like this, unless your holiday's in deeper space or something like that.
So there is a history of philosophers speaking of their experience because of a psychoactive substance and interpreting some philosophical lesson from that. And you've had a bit of a look at this. What's sort of the earliest sort of things that you found in philosophy that reference psychoactives, and you can sort of clearly draw that they're drawing that lesson from a psychoactive experience?
Well, I've made a tentative argument, speculative, about the whole of Western philosophy ultimately being triggered by psychedelic experiences. And that relies on the fact that Plato spoke of his experiences in the Eleusinian Mysteries in ancient Greece. And he speaks about visions, apparitions. He speaks about this, for example, in his book The Phaedo, which used to be known as On the Soul, and it's the first place, I believe, where Plato introduces his notion of substance dualism, the difference between the soul and the body, and also his notion of the forms, these sort of eternal objects that exist outside of our world. And so...
Just for those quickly that haven't heard of the Eleusinian Mysteries, these are a particularly interesting and still rather mysterious event that went on in ancient Greece.
Yes.
At Eleusis, and some people have speculated that the substance that was being consumed there, which for the sort of orthodox thought is that it's a wine of some kind, but there is some speculation that it might have been a tryptamine-based beverage of some kind.
Yes, actually, in Amsterdam, I was speaking to Dr. Clark, who gave a presentation about that, and he says it's a sort of analogue of ayahuasca. That's his main theory at the moment. But there are many theories. Albert Hoffman, who created LSD, for example, he said it's quite possibly in some kind of ergot-infused potion they had, the Kion, I think it was called. So these mysteries were held once a year in Eleusis, which is about 14 miles from Athens, and everyone could attend. I think it lasted about there's a greater and lesser mystery, and both of which lasted about 2 weeks. And there's a temple there, a temple of Demeter, where people travelled for it. Anyway, so getting back to the point, Plato certainly went there, Aristotle as well, and what Alfred North Whitehead says that Western philosophy consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. Plato, I believed, he himself said he was inspired by the mysteries, then goes on to write about the forms, the soul. So it's quite conceivable that the psychedelic experience he had, which I think he had, some people say it wasn't a psychedelic experience therein, but I think the evidence suggests that it was. There's a lot of evidence for it. So the psychedelic experience he had probably influenced his thinking, and that thinking, according to Whitehead, influenced the whole of Western philosophy. So that's where we begin. So I think that psychedelic experience is much more important for philosophy than people realise.
So this is about 3 to 3,500 years ago. Is that about right for Plato and Aristotle?
It was about 2,500 years ago.
Oh, 2.5.
Yeah.
So what's been the pathway since then? Did we see this continue fairly consistently over thousands of years, or?
Well, not officially. I mean, the Eleusinian Mysteries were sort of official ceremony, but they were shut down by a Roman emperor in I think the 4th century AD, and thereafter Christianity took over the West, and you do have a number of mystical theologians, for example, Plotinus, who certainly spoke about transcendental experiences. Whether that was induced by molecules is unlikely. But anyway, you get this mystical tradition, which is usually seen through the eyes of Christianity, for example, Saint Teresa and so on. But
what about in other parts of the world?
Other parts of the world, it's not really my field, I wouldn't like to say, but of course you do get the shamans in Mongolia and whatever who allegedly took fly agaric and so on and so forth.
I was more thinking of the Arabic world. is there much of a psychoactive history that you know of in the Arabic world? Because, of course, the Arabic world and the Greek and Roman worlds had a lot of interactions at those times. Or are you not sure on that area?
I wouldn't like to say that. It's not really my field. But, of course, hashish was known to have come from the Arab world. So there surely is a lot of history there. But that's not a history that I've looked into. I mean, my field is Western philosophy, really, so I have to stick to that.
Let's fast forward to the past couple of hundred years, the sort of Enlightenment and what's happened since then, where we've come out of this very much hierarchical and dogmatic way of thinking for most people, especially the popular sort of narrative. What have we seen in the past couple of hundred years?
Well, you say the Enlightenment, and the philosopher Immanuel Kant wrote an essay, of course, called "What is the Enlightenment?" and he's known as one of the main Enlightenment thinkers. He didn't, as far as I know, take any substances. He did write about Swedenborg, who was a mystic, but that's about as far as he got, as far as I know. But there was an English commentator, one of the first English commentators on Kant, was a writer on opium, the hallucinogenic or psychedelic effects of opium, and that was Thomas de Quincey. He wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater, which is not necessarily a philosophical tract, but he was, as I say, a philosopher in the sense of being a commenter on transcendental idealism, Kant's philosophy, and he did make a number of remarks in that book, which certainly can be analysed in terms of philosophy. For example, he said he believed that memories could never be lost, only their access could be lost, because under opium he recalled long forgotten events of his childhood and so on and so forth. That in itself is very interesting. So we start with Thomas de Quincey, probably. I mean, also, actually, I should say Humphrey Davy, who's really known as a chemist, but in his day, I mean, I think the word scientist only emerged in 1836 or so, so he called himself a philosopher, and he wrote about, he took massive doses of nitrous oxide, laughing gas, and wrote about it. He and Coleridge and some others in that circle wrote a book about it, and at one point seemed to reach an idealist conclusion where he said that all of reality consists of thoughts. So that's the origins of it in the West, really.
I didn't quite reach that point. I was starting to read his piece from 1800, which is researches chemical and philosophical, chiefly concerning nitrous oxide, and yes. I watched the dose that he was giving himself of nitrous oxide raise rather quickly when he found out that it wasn't harmful or not directly harmful, and it wasn't unpleasant.
Yes. It's funny, actually, because I live in Cornwall, near Land's End, and our main town is Penzance, and of course, well, not of course, but in Penzance there's one statue of Humphrey Davy. He's a sort of Penzance man, and he's known as for creating the miner's safety lamp and other things to do with engineering. But little really is emphasized with regard to these psychedelic adventures he had and wrote about.
So who else? We've got Thomas de Quincey later on in the 1800s talking about opium, which of course was around a lot with the East India Trade Company, which seemed to be trading a lot of opium across the seas. What other sorts of plants or chemicals do we see arising at this time?
Well, there are a number of so-called painkillers, which in strong enough doses had big effects on people. So, I mean, you get Baudelaire. I mean, okay, as well as, of course, cannabis. So Baudelaire and the whole Paris scene, they were mixing opium with cannabis, and that caused a movement. And but then you get painkillers like chloral hydrate, which Nietzsche took, mixed it with potassium bromide, and that seemed to induce a number of psychedelic experiences in him. And
is that the sort of thing that we could perhaps look at as very much colouring Nietzsche's ideas?
Well, in my book Pneumonautics, I've got a chapter on called Antichrist Psychonaut about that, and there's that I mean, he suffered a lot, people say from syphilis, but also could have been brain cancer or whatever, but he did suffer from these ailments and had to leave his professorship at Basel as a result of that. And it's known that he took a lot of opium. He took also a concoction of other drugs. His sister and mother actually said that he went mad and died because of his drug use, or drug abuse in this case. Riese von Schönhofer, one of his friends, said he used to go to pharmacies and prescribe all these medicines, and he was allowed because he was a doctor, but none of the pharmacists seemed to ask him what sort of doctor he was. He wasn't a medical doctor, of course, so he got away with self-prescribing whatever was available. So we don't know exactly what it was, but we know, like I say, it was chloral hydrate, potassium bromide, opium. His sister alleges that he took this Javanese concoction towards the end of his cognitive life, which was sort of in the late 1880s, which probably contained cocaine or some derivative and concoction thereof. So, interestingly, Evelyn Waugh took the same combination of chloral hydrate and potassium bromide as Nietzsche, and he wrote about it in a semi-autobiographical work called The Ordeal of Gilbert Pinfold. And in that book, he talks about having these hallucinations, in this case, you would say, hearing voices, this conspiracy against him, and so on and so forth, which is interesting. Nietzsche talks about being inspired, voices just coming to him like lightning. And one is tempted to think that these drugs perhaps caused those voices, these demons, like Socrates' demon. Perhaps he talks about being spoken to by Dionysus towards the end of his cognitive career. So perhaps Dionysus, his god Dionysus, was something he literally heard, or he thought he heard. As time went on, he thought he became Dionysus. He signed off letters as Dionysus, and then in 1889 he just lost the plot completely, and then for 10 years he didn't write anything. He was just being looked after by his sister, and then he died in 1900. So whether drugs caused that death, I don't know, but certainly he took a lot. He wrote he took a lot. There's even a trip report of flowers spiraling around his body, him seeing that. So I would think it's quite plausible that did inspire his philosophy. Also, of course, he starts his philosophy with Dionysus, he ends it with Dionysus. Dionysus was the god of intoxication. So there's a lot to be looked into there, and that's something I do look into, as I say.
You're listening to 3CR Community Radio, 855 AM, digital and streaming at 3cr.org.au. This is In Psychedelia, and right now we are speaking with Peter and, sorry, I've forgotten your last name.
Sjöstedt-H. Sjöstedt-H, yeah.
Thank you very much. Who is the author of a book called Nomenautics? Have I said that?
Nomenautics, yes, that's right.
Nomenautics.
Yeah.
You can find out about the book at philosopher.eu is the website.
Correct. Yes.
Nomenautics looks into philosophy and psychedelics and the sort of meeting ground of those two things. But so that's available now. But you're also working on a PhD, which sort of brings these themes together, because a lot of these experiences that people have under the influence of a psychoactive substance aren't the end. They're the start of a journey. They're the start of a question that gets opened in your mind from that experience, where you go, well, what exactly is this mind thing that I'm experiencing anyway? Because it's not just this everyday, the things that you can touch, see, smell, hear, and taste. There seems to be something more to that. Can you tell us a little bit about your PhD?
Yeah, sure. Well, my PhD is not directly about psychoactive substances. It's on panpsychism, or panexperientialism, more strictly, which is the view that mind is not merely a product of the brain or a nervous system, but is ubiquitous, universal in nature, which is a view which sounds somewhat mad to a lot of people, but the logic is there, and it's becoming in academic philosophy, at least I should say, it's becoming much more respectable theory, and it's very complicated, because the philosophy of mind is a very complicated area, but But
let's break it down a little bit. First of all, what are the competing models? So, first of all, when we talk about the mind, we're not talking about the brain. We're talking about the experience that you are having right now, listening to this program, where there's all sorts of things going on. Yes, you are hearing a whole bunch. You're inputting a lot of stimuli, but they're coming together in a coherent manner, perhaps not coherent, depending on how your Sunday afternoon is going. And then it's putting itself together in this thing we call consciousness. So there's a lot of different ways that this problem has been explored philosophically, whether it's through the lens of mind, spirit, consciousness, the soul, something like that. What are the current sort of competing ideas on this area?
Well, if I give you a bit of a historical background, that might highlight it a bit more clearly. So I mentioned Plato and his substance dualism, which is the view that the mind and the body are distinct substances. Now, Christianity really is a combination of Platonism and the Bible. People like St. Augustine sort of combined them. And so Christianity generally inherited, Judaism not so much, but Christianity inherited this dualism. You can interpret the Bible that way as well, like Corinthians 13 or 15, I think. Anyway, so under Christianity, which held sway in the West, of course, for almost 2,000 years, dualism seems to have been the default position. But then with the Enlightenment, you got and the advent of mechanistic science, you get this idea of materialism. I mean, that stems back to ancient Greece as well, with Democritus and then Lucretius later on. But it was more emphasized under the scientific revolution. So that's the view that there are not two substances. There's one substance, and that substance is matter. Ultimately, matter can be reduced to spatio-temporality or motion. Now, this probably was mostly instigated by René Descartes, the mathematician and philosopher, who was a Catholic. So
I think therefore I am.
Yeah, so he believed in a dualism. He said that only humans have souls, the mind, which he identified with the mind, and the rest of nature was completely mechanical, completely mathematically explainable, so even animals didn't have consciousness or whatever. And what seems to have happened is that, in the West at least, we've taken on this dualism, but we've got rid of the mind completely, and we've focused on mechanism, that which is mathematically explainable in terms of space and time. And that is a very good method for creating technology and predicting the future. It's a great method, and it's created the technology we see. But it's often forgotten that this excluded the mind in the first place. So if you would take that method to be an ontology, an actual like a dogma that this is reality, matter, you then have to recreate mind, as it were, out of that matter. And then what happened is we got a number of theories about how mind comes out of matter, and that's called emergentism. So you had the British emergentists in the late 19th and early 20th century. It started with John Stuart Mill, included people like Samuel Alexander, and it ended with C.D. Broad, who's mentioned in Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, in his book of 1925. And so that's the view that the mind emerges from matter when matter is organized in particular ways in the brain. This, however, was really ended with C.D. Broad in 1925 with the advent of quantum mechanics, because a number of the analogies that emergentists made with nature were seen to be redundant. So, for example, the emergentist said, look, the mind emerges from the brain just as certain chemical properties emerge from physics, and that's just brute emergence. We've got no explanation of how it happens. We know they're correlated, and that we have to have, Samuel Alexander said, natural piety. We just have to accept this brute emergence. Well, with quantum mechanics, you didn't need to accept that. You could further reduce these emergent chemical properties down to electromagnetism. So the analogies British emergentists used became redundant, so that was sort of dropped. In its place came a number of other materialist notions, such as identity theory, which just simply said, well, no, by a mental term like happiness, you actually mean a certain movement in the brain, or by sadness, another certain movement in the brain. We might say, lack of dopamine or something like this. But that was seen to be implausible as well, logically, because of, for example, because of something called multiple realization. So if you were to say something like, the color yellow simply is certain activity in the occipital lobe, that would then exclude the color yellow from other creatures which didn't have occipital lobes, like birds or octopuses or something like this. And we can't dogmatically say they can't see yellow.
There's an empirical problem there.
Yeah, and also, the possibility of artificial intelligence, would mean that, robots could never perceive anything, or machines could never perceive anything. So that was sort of dropped on logical grounds. And then you had other theories like behaviorism, which just said, well, the meaning of a mental term is simply the behavior that is correlated to it. So happiness simply is smiling, simply is laughing, simply is jumping or whatever. But that would seem to be logically implausible as well, because of the number of paradoxes you get from that. So then from the 1970s onwards, you got a return to emergentism. And that's a sort of prevalent paradigm of philosophy of mind now, which is that, okay, certain emergencies in nature can be explained through quantum mechanics or whatever it may be, but certain others can't, and we'll use this as an analogy to how the mind emerges from the brain. Personally, I think that view of emergentism doesn't work. Its leading expositors like Jae-won Kim find it highly problematic. So as a result of that, you get this recently, you get this wide variety of views of what the mind is and how it's related to matter. Obviously, it is related to matter. And one of those is panpsychism, which denies such brute emergence. It rather says that mind was always there, so you don't need to say that mind emerged from matter, because matter really is an abstraction which already included mind. So that's what I'm working on now.
So that sort of reminds me of a quote from Aldous Huxley about the, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's about the brain being essentially a reducing valve of this thing that's broadcast everywhere, the mind.
Yes. Being
broadcast everywhere, and your brain just tries to filter all this stuff coming in so that it's effective for the mammalian physical form. Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Well, that's one option. That Aldous Huxley quotes that from C.D. Broad, whom I mentioned, and C.D. Broad actually talks about Bergson in that respect, so Henri Bergson, the French philosopher. I don't know if I follow that view entirely, because I don't think there's enough data yet to substantiate that. But interestingly, Amanda Fielding, who heads the Beckley Foundation, who has sponsored a lot of this recent brain imaging of LSD and psilocybin and so on, she said recently, after the LSD results were in, she said that Huxley, therefore Bergson, and William James had this reducing valve idea, and these latest findings from Imperial College substantiate that idea. So I've spoken to some of the people involved with that study. That's not necessarily the view they take, but it's an interesting one, and that's a good example of how philosophy and psychedelic science can come together, because one interesting thing one of the main aspects of philosophy of mind are the so-called neural correlates of consciousness. And when we look at, if it is the case that certain psychedelics reduce activity in the brain, which are correlated to an increase in phenomenal activity, then certainly we would need to adjust our whole view of the mind. And that's why psychedelics are really so important to our understanding of the mind and reality. In fact, I remember Professor Nutt, who led that study in Imperial College. He was asked, what was the main thing you got out of the study? And he said, if you want to understand consciousness, you've got to look at psychedelics. And that's why I'm pushing it all the time, because psychedelics do have so much to say about these fundamental metaphysical views of reality.
We're almost out of time, Peter, and thank you for talking to us so far. I think there's, again, everyone we speak to on the program, there's so much more to talk about, but unfortunately we have an hour on the program, so we've only got to talk about a small little bit, and then you can find out more by getting online and having a look for these people, and also looking for other interviews, other articles that they've written. But all of this sort of reminds me, one of my favourite neuroscientists, or actually I don't think he was a neuroscientist, he was neuro something, he had a really long title, Oliver Sacks, who wrote a number of books on people's bizarre experiences, patients that he had worked with, of the sort of bizarre experiences, especially around hallucinations or distorted realities or delusional experiences that they had. And Oliver said that one of the ways that he found that he was able to relate to his patients was through the use of through his own personal use of various psychoactive substances, because he'd have an experience and realize that was what, Sally told him about on Tuesday or whatever. So these are tools for being able to experience these states of mind, which sometimes occur because of some strange abnormality at birth, or sometimes because of brain injury, or sometimes because of some other health consequence, and sometimes they're not caused by a health problem at all, and sometimes they don't cause problems for people.
Yes. Well, yeah, I mean, Oliver Sacks was a massive user of psychedelic drugs. His book Hallucinations brings it out well. In fact, at one point he took the same drugs as Nietzsche, which was very telling for me, because it sort of went more into what could happen when you're on these things.
So Peter, if people want to, if people are interested, the listener at home interested, or in the car, wherever they are, interested in finding out more about your work, especially for those young budding philosophers or hobbyist philosophers out there, where can they go to find out more information?
Well, my website is, as you say, www.philosopher.eu. That's the main source of information. But I've also got a YouTube channel and a Facebook channel where I post daily snippets of information, philosophical stuff, and a Twitter account. The Facebook one is facebook.com/ontologistics. YouTube is youtube.com/ontologistics. Twitter is the username is Peter Sjöstedt-H, one word. There's a few other things I can't remember now, but I'm here and there on the internet.
And we will, of course, share all of those things on the In Psychedelia Facebook page. So if you're following along, then you can find out more about Peter's work online. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on In Psychedelia today. I hope we can talk more in the future and drill down into some of those things.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.